You're always blurry. Always pixelate in the beginning, and then like a couple of minutes, you clear up. We're live, Alexander. Let's talk about the AUKUS. First of all, how are you doing in London?
Yeah. I'm doing very well. Very well. Beautiful sunny day here. I walked my dogs first thing because they needed their monthly checkup, and I took them out for a lovely walk. It's beautiful sunshine. You feel great when the weather's like this. I have to say, London at its best is unbeatable.
All right, great. So, we decided to just do a live today on this story, which is a huge story. And you've prepared, I believe you just finished a really big video on this, which will be up on your channel and will also be up on Locals, the Duran.locals.com. So you did a really in-depth, good breakdown of this. And this is kind of in your wheelhouse as well. So we said, let's just do a live. Let's have you kind of give, a big picture view of what's going on. We'll put your video up on your channel as well as on Locals, which will provide a lot more detail to all of this. And I think we'll have a good picture of this story, and we would have covered it really well. It is a huge story, Alexander. So let's just jump right into it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Once again, we just decided to go live. No notifications, nothing. We just said, let's just go straight live into it. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Alexander, AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. AUKUS, nukes. France is screwed. China's pissed off. What is Indochina is the new battleground, I guess. What is going on here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's the overarching story. I mean, the United States is losing interest in Europe. I think that's becoming increasingly clear. It's now focusing more and more on the Pacific. It sees it's the great existential struggle with China in the Pacific for world leadership. And that's really the focus of all of this. And we see the United States trying to build up and strengthen its alliance systems. Of course, Australia is already an ally. It's a member of the Five Eyes. So, in a way, AUKUS simply confirms that which was already true, which is that Australia is an ally of the United States. But, of course, what AUKUS does, this new alliance, is that it enables the United States to probably resolve any legal issues it has about providing nuclear technology to Australia. And that's what this is really all about. It's providing Australia with nuclear technology to build nuclear-powered submarines. Now, the Chinese are furious. Predictably, they're complaining that nuclear-powered submarines is only a step away from nuclear weapons, which, by the way, in a certain technological position is true. But having said that, I have to say also that if we start going down the road of Australia acquiring nuclear weapons, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty is dead. And I don't believe that's what the United States wants to see. So I think that might be a little bit, overreaction on the part of China. I don't think this deal with the submarines is going to make a huge amount of difference in military terms, because they will take a long time to get sorted, and this is a complicated technology. We're probably not going to see these submarines for, say, 10 years.
15 years is what I read.
10, 15 years. Well, there you go.
Years, yeah.
So, I mean, the Russians are busy building nuclear submarines in the North Atlantic. The Chinese are, of course, building nuclear submarines in the Pacific already. So, this isn't going to make a major difference in the strategic balance of power. But it signals to the world that the United States sees China as its main adversary, that the Pacific is the part of the world where the great conflict is now happening. And it's, I think, also an attempt by the United States to use its alliance with Australia as the foundation for an alliance system it wants to create in the Pacific. And if you look at the remarks that Scott Morrison made, that's the Australian Prime Minister, in this tripartite discussion with Boris Johnson of Britain and Biden of the United States, he mentioned a whole string of other organizations, ASEAN, the Quad, which of course includes India, and of course he also alluded to the relationship with New Zealand. And you can see that the idea is, I think, to use this new alliance as the core around which more allies will be drawn in. New Zealand to start with, perhaps others. I have to say, that doesn't look like it's happening for the moment. And I wonder whether this is really going to be the way things turn out. My own view is that this is a big move, but not one that's been fully thought through, and which might actually increase the US's strategic problems long term. And the reason I say that is because one of the effects it's had is that it has, of course, upset the Europeans. And the French are absolutely incandescent about this. They're talking about a Trafalgar moment. You know, Trafalgar was that battle where they were defeated by the Royal Navy, by Admiral Nelson back in the era of Napoleon. Well, you know, when the French start making those kind of comparisons, you start to get a sense of how angry they are. Partly it's because, of course, the French have lost this massive arms deal. And, you know, we mustn't underestimate that. But the French arms is an enormous part of their exports. They really care about this. They had this massive deal, $43 billion deal with Australia. French workers will lose jobs because it's not going to happen. But I think on top of the arms deal and the prospects of future arms deals, which was also concerning the French, what they have now been told by the United States in unequivocal terms is that Europe, France, is no longer as important to the United States as it was, because the focus of American interest is no longer confronting Russia in Europe. It is confronting China in the Pacific. So that the relationships with the European powers, NATO itself, all of that is from now on going to be downgraded. And it is extraordinary to see. And of course, the French are complaining that Biden is behaving like Trump, because they were complaining that Trump was downgrading NATO. And here we go, and we see the man that they were all lobbying for, the person who the Europeans thought was their friend, and it turns out is not a great friend after all. So, I mean, you know, it's a big signal of a major strategic shift. I'm going to add one final point about France, which is, of course, and this I know from, you know, knowing France very well, there will be a lot of people in the French government and in the French political class who will be extremely annoyed that Britain has been asked to be part of this AUKUS arrangement and not France. Because, of course, from their point of view, I mean, you know, Britain is the old enemy. It's also, you know, the country with which they've been allies. But, you know, the French and the British always have difficult and tense relations. So the fact that Washington has done a deal with Australia, which involves Britain and which excludes and hurts France, the French are going to take that extremely badly. And one should not underestimate that. And that's going to affect the way the French see things.
Yeah, will the French actually do something? I mean, will Europe do something? Morrison did come out with a statement, and he said that, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, I believe France will understand. We're just doing this in our own national interests, blah, blah, blah. But will the French or will Europe, you know, take any action? Will they distance themselves from the United States? Will they start to perhaps pursue their own sovereignty, their own foreign policy, countries of the EU, or no, they're just gonna take this?
Well, I think for the moment they're going to take this. To be straightforward about this, I think long term, I think this is a shock. And I think that there will be, I mean, France is a restless country. I mean, I think that's a point to make here. I mean, there's been problems about the pandemic, which the coup, we've talked about that. But also there's been a growing sense in France that France is not, France is in decline, that it's being downgraded in Europe, that the Germans are dominant in Europe. And now they see that the British and the Americans don't take them seriously either. So France is a restless country. It's made sacrifices for the alliance system. It's seen that in return, the Germans have done the deal with the Russians over Nord Stream 2, and the Americans complied with it. And they've now seen that the Americans have just cut them out of a big arms deal that they had with Australia. And a lot of people in France, I know, are upset and worried about that. They don't have the same kind of issues with China that people have in the United States. They don't have the same kind of complexes about Russia that people have in the United States. They fought 2 world wars with Russia as an ally, and there is still a certain memory in France. There is always this memory in France of the time when France and Russia were allies from the 1890s and fought the First World War together. So I can see that perhaps over time they might start to slowly and gradually and hesitatingly reassess their policies and say to themselves, well, look, the Americans don't really care about us. They're not interested in us. They treat us as a doormat. The British are off doing their own thing with the Americans in the Pacific. The Germans just march all over us as they want. They do their deals with the Russians at the same time as they insist that we must comply with everything that they do. So perhaps the time has come when we need to reassess our relations and our policies. And they could do it in one of 2 ways. One, which is the Macron way, which is to pursue more Europe, to try to take a more integrationist policies in Europe. The idea is to try and build up Europe as some kind of, rival superpower. The problem with that from the French point of view is that if that happens, they will fall even further under German dominance. And there are many people in France who are now becoming disaffected with the EU. The second is for France to take a more souverainist policy. That means starting to perhaps forge closer links with Russia again, perhaps starting to edge away from the sanctions policy. Macron has talked about it at various times. Perhaps this will give it extra impetus. But to be very clear, nothing is going to happen before the elections next year. And if anything does happen, then it will depend very much on who actually wins those elections and what kind of policies they follow.
Okay, so let's we talked about the EU, we talked about France. Let's talk about some more countries and how they're reacting to this. Let's talk about China. How are they reacting to this?
Well, they're absolutely furious. I'm going to make a point here, and it's not one point I didn't make in my video, but because it was really becoming extremely long. But it's a point I do want to make, and that is that the Chinese have been extremely loud and, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, bullying towards Australia over the last couple of years, as Australia has tilted away from China and towards the United States. And I think the Chinese never appreciated that inevitably Australia, as an English-speaking country, would ultimately always align with the United States against China. And I have to say, I think all this, ferocious language, the sanctions, the economic pressure, all of that, what is actually done is that ultimately it's pushed Australia further away from China and closer to the United States. And I think that perhaps a year ago, 2 years ago, the Australians would not have considered this kind of deal because they wouldn't have wanted to rock the boat with China. And I think China's very strong policies towards Australia have now brought the Australians to the point where the Australians have done this. And I think that's a lesson the Chinese need to understand, that sometimes talking soft is actually more effective than talking big and being abrasive. Sometimes you have to be abrasive, but sometimes I think it can be counterproductive. And I think in this case, this deal that's now been done is a sign of that. So that's the first thing I want to say. But the second thing is, when the Chinese look at all of this, when they see the Australia acquiring nuclear submarines, I don't think they are particularly worried for the reasons that we said, because Australia by itself is not a major power. It's a big country territorially, but it's not a major, top economy. It's got a fairly small population. Its military resources will always be limited. And of course, it's always been an ally of the United States anyway. And these nuclear submarines are, at least a decade away. So I don't think that's what the Chinese are concerned about exactly. But there is one nightmare for the Chinese, and it's a topic I did discuss in my video, which is that the Chinese are saying, well, if Australia acquires nuclear-powered submarines, other countries might feel tempted to do the same. And though the Chinese are not saying which country, it's quite obvious to me which country it is that they're really worried about. And that country is Japan. And for the Chinese, the fear, the overarching fear, is of Japan acquiring first nuclear submarines and then eventually nuclear weapons. Japan has a mighty shipbuilding industry. They could certainly build nuclear-powered submarines. It's got all the technological and industrial skills to do it. It already has some of the most powerful conventionally powered submarines in the world, submarines that are comparable in size to a nuclear-powered submarine. All they would need is to be redesigned very little and have a nuclear reactor inserted, and they would be extremely potent and effective nuclear-powered submarines. And of course, for the Chinese, the absolute strategic nightmare is that Japan then takes the next step and acquires nuclear weapons. So that's what I think is the thing that worries China most. I think they're much more worried about what Japan is going to do than what the United States, what Australia is going to do. And if they're probably saying to themselves, is this step that Australia is taking going to lead to Japan saying to itself, well, perhaps we should do the same thing?
Okay, so what is Australia going to do? Let's talk about Australia now. Are they going to eventually, after 15, 20, 25 years, are they looking to go nuclear?
Well, of course, Morrison denies this. Biden denies this. Australia is a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If Australia goes nuclear, it has to quit the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, at which case that treaty is, in my opinion, all but dead, because if a country like Australia pulls out of it, well, it has no future existence anymore. But I have to say this, if you look at the countries that have nuclear-powered submarines, they're also the same countries that have nuclear weapons. The two tend to go together. And I think that acquiring nuclear-powered submarines is a big step towards acquiring nuclear weapons. If you look at other countries that have them, as I said, Britain, France, Russia, the United States, China, they are all nuclear-powered, nuclear weapons states. So is India, which is now building nuclear-powered submarines and which has previously leased nuclear-powered submarines from the Russians. North Korea is also building, or says it's going to build, nuclear-powered submarines. It would be interesting to see if it does, by the way. But of course, it too is a nuclear-powered state. So it would be anomalous if Australia operated and ran nuclear-powered submarines, but didn't take that big further step of acquiring nuclear weapons. But it would be a huge step for Australia to take. I'm at the moment they're saying they won't do it. If they do it, well, frankly, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is dead. And I have to say, if that were to happen, I think that would be very bad news, not just for China and Russia, but also, and extremely so, for the United States. Because the United States, with its worldwide policies, certainly does not want the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to collapse and lots of countries then starting to acquire nuclear weapons. That would be an uncontrollable situation and one which would be very dangerous, principally for the United States, and would in effect make regime change wars in the future impossible.
Yeah, nuke powered doesn't mean nuke armed. I'm looking in the live chat. Yeah, but that is your point, Alexander, is that if you look at the case of all the countries that do have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear powered submarines. So it could be the natural progression for Australia to go down that path. We're not saying they will, but it could be.
And they're categorically denying that they will. But denials today might not be quite so effective in 10, 15, 20 years' time. I mean, we'll see. And we're a long way from that point. And as I said, I can't really see the US wanting that to happen. but then you never know. And as I said, it's a logical step. I should say that, to my knowledge, all the countries that have acquired nuclear-powered submarines have already been nuclear weapon states. So it's usually you get your nuclear weapon, then you build your nuclear-powered submarines. Exactly. Now, if it goes the other way, the Australians would be doing the opposite. They're not the only people who are thinking, by the way, about nuclear-powered submarines. Brazil has been talking about it. I believe Argentina also has been, but they've done nothing to put that into effect up to now.
All right. Alan Watson, thank you for moderating, the great Alan Watson in the house. Alexander, you are in London. What is the UK? What is the UK up to? Why are they involved in this?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, why are they involved in this? Because, again, ultimately, one does wonder what role the United Kingdom has in what goes on in the Pacific region. I think the reason they're involved is because political relations between Britain and Australia are so strong and so close. And I think that's something which perhaps outsiders don't fully recognize. When we discussed this a lot, if you remember, during the Russiagate affair, and all those connections between Alexander Downer and the Australian ambassador to London and the people he was meeting and all those sort of things that were happening then. The political classes of Britain and Australia are incredibly closely interconnected. There is very long-standing intelligence cooperation between Britain and Australia. They're both part of the Five Eyes. The British, when they developed their own nuclear weapons, they tested them back in the 50s in Australia. So these two countries are very, very heavily involved in each other. And of course, we share the same head of state, who is the Queen. I mean, she's Queen of Australia, just as she's Queen of Great Britain. So, we have this very strong historic link with Australia, which is, a fraternal country as far as we're concerned. And probably the Australians would have wanted Britain to be involved in some way. And from a British point of view, it would have been a failure on the part of Britain not to have been involved, because just to cede Australia, if you like, to the United States, to accept that for Australia, the alliance with the United States takes so much greater precedence than Australia's long historic connections to Britain, would be extremely difficult for the British political class to accept. So I think that was why they wanted to be involved. It shows them playing a big role alongside the United States in the Pacific. It makes the British feel important. It reassures them that their connection to Australia remains strong, and it reassures the Australians that the connection to Britain remains strong, which is important to the Australians, I suspect, more for cultural and sentimental reasons than any others.
All right. Before we get to the United States, can you touch upon how, real briefly, how Russia is looking at all of this?
I think they're quietly pleased. I'm going to say that straightforwardly. And I'll explain why. Yeah, I'll explain why. First of all, anything that involves and entangles the United States in a conflict with China in the Pacific is good news for Moscow, because it means that pressure on them in Europe slackens. So I think they will probably feel to themselves, well, if the Americans are messing around in the Pacific, getting involved with submarines in Australia and getting themselves up against the Chinese dragon in the Pacific, well, that means less pressure on us. We can go ahead, do our major exercises in Europe, Zapad to 2021 and all that. And, ultimately we feel that we have a freer hand in Europe than we might otherwise have done. We're more stable in Europe than we might otherwise have been. We can perhaps start to extract more concessions from the Europeans. We got Nord Stream 2 done. It's completed, still waiting for its license, but everybody expects that it will get its license pretty soon. And maybe we can start whispering to the French, for example, well, look, where does this alliance with the Americans get you? You just get screwed by the Biden administration in the Pacific, and you're clearly not a major and important friend of the United States anymore. So I think the Russians will be going away. They'll be reassessing this. They'll be saying to themselves, well, this has a lot of good things for us. There is one thing that the Russians will be nervous about, and I've discussed this before in other programs, which is that they're reading all this, they can read just as we can, all this rhetoric that's coming out of China about, very, very strong rhetoric about China being prepared for a war and, being willing to engage the United States in a conflict, and China wanting, being ready for a battle over Taiwan and in the South China Sea and all that. The Russians do not want a war in the Pacific. They do not want a war anywhere. They certainly do not want a conflict between China and the United States in the Pacific, where they have only marginal interests in which the Chinese would try to drag them in. So I think that the one thing they will be doing, to the extent that they can, is that they'll be trying to tell the Chinese, look, slow down, don't get so angry. Obviously, you need us more than you did before. We will provide you with all the raw materials and the food that Australia once did, and we can provide you with much more than the Australians once did. But at the end of the day, let's both sit down, play the long game. We got time on our side. Let's not get drawn into any provocations. Let's not get into a battle over Taiwan. We don't need that. It's not good for us, and it's not good for you. So I suspect behind the scenes, they're a moderating influence.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the United States then. And so much news in the United States. We've gone from Afghanistan to literally yesterday, the whole Milley thing, which has not gone away. It's still there, and we're still waiting.
It's got to get bigger. It's going to get
bigger. Absolutely, it's going to get bigger. There is a civil war in the United States, and it's taking place in the halls of power of DC, and it's taking place with the Democrat machine. Let's just call it that, the Democrat machine. And
I agree. And I also think, by the way, that there's a conflict within the Pentagon, which is something we perhaps might want to talk about at some point, because we're getting some generals saying, we mustn't have a war. It'd be a disaster for us. We're having others who are talking quite differently. I suspect the ground military, people like Milley, who is, after all, an American Army general, are becoming a bit concerned that Europe is being downgraded, whereas I suspect the US Navy and the Strategic Command, the people who run the nuclear weapons, people like Hyten, they want to focus instead on the Pacific. So I think that there is that conflict also going on within the Pentagon, and that's part of an overarching conflict, which is a much more political conflict and a much more important one within the Democratic Party and the political class. But anyway, let's press on about the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the United States. Obviously, this wasn't just thought up today. This has probably been in the works for a good long time, but it did drop at a very interesting moment in time for the United States. Alexander, what is going on here? You touched upon it in the intro. The United States appears to be pulling back from the Middle East. I don't buy it, but let's just say it appears to be pulling back. With this move, one could say that it appears to be diminishing the importance of Europe and the European Union, notwithstanding the UK. The European Union appears to be saying, you know what, we've got these guys locked up anyway, so we don't really need to focus that much on them. And the big pivot is the Pacific and Asia, Indochina, the whole area. Is this the case? Remember, Obama back in the day, when he first got into office, he said that was his priority was China and the Pacific, but that never worked out, and he focused on the Middle East as well and Russia. But are we seeing Obama's policy finally play out?
Well, one would think so, except I doubt that it will. And I this is where I really want to talk about this, because this deal with Australia, as we said, it doesn't actually change the military equation in the Pacific. It does signal that the United States is saying publicly that we're going to focus on the Pacific. And ever since the Obama administration era, the US, or at least some people in the US, and it's important to say some people in the US, have gradually begun to understand that since the 90s, the US has been wasting its time on peripheral questions, on the Middle East, on Europe, on the conflict with Russia, whereas the real challenge to US global leadership is not coming from Russia, it comes from China, and China's been able to use all that time and all that space that it was getting because the US was letting itself get distracted with other things. It was using all that time to build itself up, to become an economic colossus, to become a trading colossus, to become the world's biggest manufacturing power, and to build up massive armed forces, which are now starting to challenge in scale those of the United States itself. So there's been constant talk for at least 10 years now about the United States pulling back from all these other places, focusing instead on the Pacific and taking on China. The trouble is, though, that is a view that some people hold in the United States, and the sort of people who hold those ideas are at the moment in the ascendant, and that's why they're making these alliances. Whenever the United States really does try and pull back from all these other places, from the Middle East, from Europe, from wherever, what you see is, firstly, the Europeans, the Middle Eastern powers, the Saudis, all of those, they start getting very worked up, very angry. They start complaining bitterly that the United States is betraying them, that the United States is letting them down. You see countries like Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states starting to, Georgia, starting to raise all their sort of issues. And of course, what you also find is that you run up against the various neocon groups in Washington, D.C. itself, who will never agree to retreat anywhere. They cannot accept, for example, that maybe the moment has come to scale back US support for Ukraine, or that, the United States should take a forceful posture in Syria, for example. They will resist every step of retreat anywhere. So the result is that the United States, for a brief time, makes these big moves against China. It inexorably gets drawn back towards worrying about the Middle East, worrying about Europe, trying to sort of promote democracy promotion in places like Belarus, for example, which, of course, in the end, ultimately ties up those very same American resources that the Americans say they want to release so that they can refocus them against China. I don't believe there's going to be any real American retreat. I don't think America knows how to retreat. I think that it has no reverse gear. And I think that's the problem because, Frederick the Great, who was the great Prussian king and general, he once said that he who tries to defend everything defends nothing. And I think in the end, what we're going to see is that the United States is going to try not just to defend everything, but to go on the offensive everywhere. And eventually that will create all kinds of problems in all sorts of places, which will mean that the United States again will be obliged to take its eye off the ball and will be forced back to Europe, to the Middle East, to wherever, even as the situation in the Pacific tilts again ever more in China's favor. That's what I think is going to happen, because that kind of realism, that kind of strategic realism that would really require a ruthless, single-minded focus on China is never going to establish itself in Washington. I should say I've been recently helping somebody with an international relations degree. Is he helping somebody, just reading all the things that they've been doing from an American university. And I've been reading the kind of things that, people study. These are the sort of people who end up in the State Department. And the kind of literature these people are being pumped with, which is purely neocon literature, is not going to make them want to pull back anywhere at all. And, they are being hardwired to think always in this offensive way. So they're not going to pull back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's what worries me. is that you're having a lot of entanglements now. Countries are lining up. They really are, and they're forming alliances. And we've got all kinds of new acronyms, and I'll get to that as well. But when countries are starting to align themselves, sooner or later there's going to be some sort of standoff. The two groups, the two gangs in the playground are going to want to duke it out, right? It's just a natural way things are going to move. So we now have the AUKUS. We have the AUKUS now. We have the Three Eyes. We also have the Five Eyes, but now we have the Three Eyes as well. And Alexander, we have the Quad coming up as well. And you may want to talk about the Quad, not the Squad, the Quad. The United States, Australia, India, and Japan. You talked about Japan, but now we got to talk about India. When we talk about India, on the one side, we're going to have to talk about Pakistan, who's going to inevitably be on the other side, right? So this is what's worrying me. A lot of entanglements. Sooner or later, they're going to want to decide who the big boy is on the global stage. That's where we may be heading. I'm not saying it's going to be in a year or 2 or 3. Maybe it's going to be in 10, 15, 20 years. But that appears to be the trajectory. So, Alexander, wrap it up. Entanglements, the Quad, India. What do you want to? What do you want to hit?
Absolutely. Well, I think actually. Well, let's actually briefly talk about India, because India has its many problems with China. It's had wars on its border with China. It feels that there's a large part of its territory, or what it claims is its territory, which is occupied by China. And of course, China is a strong ally of Pakistan, which is India's perennial enemy. India is a nuclear power. Pakistan is a nuclear power. And of course, India feels also that it's lost a major strategic ally with the fall of the Ashraf Ghani government in Afghanistan. So the Indians are very nervous at the moment, and they're being persuaded. The United States is telling them, integrate yourself, get drawn into our alliance system, become part, make this Quad into something harder, into something more strong, more crystallized, and make it into a real alliance instead of a symbolic alliance. And there are undoubtedly some people in New Delhi who are saying, let's do that. And by the way, not just in New Delhi, I mean, a large part of the business community in Mumbai is apparently outspokenly in favor of an out-and-out alliance with the United States. But then, of course, there are other people in India who say to themselves, this, is the United States really reliable? We've seen in Afghanistan that it might not be fully reliable. Are we going to sacrifice our long-standing allies and friends like Russia? Russia has always stood by us in all our various conflicts in the past. It's now very close to China. Are we going to lose them to China completely? Are we, on the other hand, going to try and keep a balance between the US and maintain our connections to Russia? Do we really want to treat China, which is our biggest trade partner, as an absolute enemy, given that China massively outmatches us on the border? And if there's a conflict there, we would probably lose. So, we've got all of these issues playing out in India, and I suspect India is extremely divided. And the other thing is, of course, this. India will be saying to itself, and remember, India is a country which has aspirations and ultimately the potential to become a great power itself. India will say to itself, well, do we really want to get into a conflict with China over issues that are of no concern to us? Like, for example, Taiwan and its status. Is this something we really want to get drawn into? Are we really going to die to defend Taiwan? And probably there will be many people in India. India has an enormously sophisticated foreign service, by the way, who will be arguing strongly against doing that. So I think India is unsure which way it wants to go. I think it's keeping all its options open. It's maintaining a very close relationship with Russia. It continues to buy arms from Russia. It's trying to balance its relations with Russia to some extent with the United States, but it wants to ensure itself by, at the same time, having a close defense relationship with the United States, which it feels gives it leverage and protection against China without going so far as to commit itself to a full-scale alliance with the United States. So that's what I think India's policy is all about. But of course, there are other countries. Now, Japan, we've talked about already. It's in a hostile relationship with China. Its relations with China have been very difficult for many years. They're getting worse. It's also wanted to try and maintain some kind of good relationship with Russia. But in Japan's case, it sees China as an existential threat. And of course, Japan has its own concerns about China, independent of those of the United States. And the danger is that China and Japan might find themselves in conflict. And then, of course, if the United States is obligated to defend Japan, it could find itself getting drawn into that. And then, of course, you've got North Korea to think about, because North Korea is very unpredictable. We don't really know what they're up to. Kim Jong-un doesn't talk to the Americans anymore. He did once when Donald Trump was president, but he's apparently very disillusioned with them. He's got to worry about economic problems. He's becoming, it seems, more dependent on the Chinese, but he's building up his arsenal all the time. He's become effectively the leader of what you could call a pocket superpower. He's got all the weapon systems of a superpower without actually being one. A very dangerous thing, by the way. And you've got the ASEAN states, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. They're very wary. They don't want to get drawn in, but they sense that all this alphabet soup of alliances, you know, a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. These are the Russian, Chinese ones on the one hand. And then we got AUKUS, ANZAC, or whatever it's called, the NATO, if you like, in the West. All of these, all of these, all quads, all this sort of thing on the other. So all of these countries are now going to be looking at this. And the problem with alliances, these very complicated alliance systems, is that the great powers that run them often find them very difficult to control, unless they're very centralized in the way that NATO is to some extent centralized. But let's say, for example, Taiwan does something which gets it involved in a struggle with China, just as Georgia got involved in a struggle with Russia back in 2008. If Taiwan has some kind of defense cooperation treaty with the United States, what does the United States do? Does it cut it off and see its entire alliance system crumble, or does it defend it? And, you know, it's very easy to see how, as a result of this very complex alphabet soup of alliances that are emerging, that you're going to have points of friction which could drag in the great powers and lead to a global confrontation, which is probably not what the great powers themselves want to see happen. That was, by the way, how the First World War started. There were these two big alliance systems, the French and the Russians on the one hand, the Germans and the Austrians on the other. Their respective allies in the Balkans had all sorts of conflicts and wars with each other. And eventually, if you read the history of that time, it's because of these problems in the Balkans that these two great alliance systems in the end went to war, even though ultimately they had no particular reason at that time to do so. So that's always the danger.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very dangerous trajectory. I don't know. Just feels like we're heading towards something really bad. Valley S is also moderating. Valley S is in the house, and GEC812 also moderating in the house. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this live stream. Thank you to the moderators, as always, doing a great, great job keeping the chat moving and flowing. Alexander, let's take some questions from the English loyalist. What would make life harder for China is giving Taiwan nukes. It would make China think twice about invading and their military might useless.
Well, can I say so straight away that, of course, if we gave, nukes to Taiwan, again, that would be the end of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think we need to understand that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is the absolute fundamental building block of international arms control. I mean, there would then be a real danger of a free-for-all with all kinds of countries around the world acquiring nuclear weapons. But before we got to that point, before Taiwan acquired those nuclear weapons, the Chinese would presumably know about it. I mean, and they would react. I mean, remember how the United States reacted when the Russians tried to install, or in fact did install briefly, nuclear weapons on Cuba. The world nearly went into a global nuclear war, and China would react in the same way if Taiwan were to appear to be edging towards acquiring nuclear weapons. I'm going to say very straightforwardly, I doubt anything like that could happen in Taiwan without the Chinese getting wind of it long before it happened. I think the Chinese undoubtedly have Taiwan under intense surveillance. They probably have the place riddled with their agents, and I'm sure they have all the electronic spying and all that kind of thing. If they got the sense that Taiwan was moving towards acquiring nuclear weapons, or that the United States was thinking seriously about installing nuclear weapons in Taiwan, I think that would provoke an immediate Chinese military reaction, and that would precipitate almost certainly the very same situation that we're talking about. If, of course, Taiwan were to acquire nuclear weapons, then quite true, that would change the strategic calculus. But precisely for that reason, I can't imagine the Chinese would allow it.
And like magic, your picture is now clear. I don't know what YouTube is doing, but it's finally good to see you in clarity. Alexander, what would stop? Well, not what would stop. How is Iran going to act after looking at all of this?
Well,
Iran.
again,
does it give them a little bit more, wiggle room to push forward with their possible nuclear aspirations? Because
it may do. Well, can I just say, I am much more cynical about the Iranian nuclear program than some people are. I know a lot of people say that Iran has no intention of ever acquiring nuclear weapons, that this is not on Iran's agenda, that the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, has issued fatwas that say that this is haram, that this is forbidden under Islamic law. I'm much more skeptical about these assurances than some people are. These fatwas that Khamenei has issued, these edicts, seem to me more about the use of nuclear weapons as opposed to their possession. At least that's how I tend to read them. And I think that Iran is keeping the option of acquiring nuclear weapons always there. I think it understands that if it acquires nuclear weapons, that might actually be a problem for it, because, frankly, the Russians and the Chinese would not be pleased, and that might open up the way for further sanctions. But at the same time, I think it feels that if it goes up to the point where it looks like it's going to acquire nuclear weapons, then it can always use that fact as leverage to extract concessions from the United States and the West. It can always say to the United States and the West, well, look, if you impose more sanctions upon us, if you launch a military attack upon us, we're going to take the next step. That's just one small step away. We're going to get ourselves a nuclear weapon, at which point your leverage over us ends, and we're in a much more powerful position than we were, and you face all the strategic nightmares that we're talking about. So I think that is the game the Iranians are playing. I don't think that they're exactly planning to acquire nuclear weapons, but I think they are deliberately creating ambiguity around this issue and leaving themselves the option open. Why else would they be enriching uranium to the extent that they are? That's my own personal view. Anyway, what will the Iranians be making of all of this? I think they'll be looking at it and they'll be saying to themselves, again, very much the same sort of things as the Russians are. They'll be saying, well, the Americans are gradually becoming drawn into this epic conflict, this epic struggle with China. And so we are now acquiring more strategic wriggle room for ourselves, because the Chinese are going to need us, and that means that we can look forward to a better economic and trade relationship with China, and we can get more protection from the Chinese and the Russians in the UN Security Council when the topic of sanctions comes up. So they're looking to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at the forthcoming summit in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, which is only days away now. And I think they will be saying to themselves, well, this is all excellent news for us. It's exactly what we want to see. Trouble between the United States and China gives us political and diplomatic space.
Yeah. What, if any, economic sanctions or other belligerent activity has China established against Taiwan? How does this compare to the blockade the U.S. has on Cuba?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, this is the thing, because, of course, China up to now has pursued a completely different policy towards Taiwan that the United States has, in the sense that China always insists that Taiwan is an island of China. It's a breakaway province of China. It's ruled by an illegal and illegitimate authority. But at one and the same time, China maintains extremely close economic cooperation with Taiwan. It imports products from Taiwan. It's up to now imported many of its most sophisticated microchips from from Taiwan. So, I mean, the Chinese have pursued until very recently a policy of very close economic cooperation, which is partly obviously intended for their own benefit, because, it means that they can tap into Taiwan's technological expertise, but also undoubtedly they see that as a pathway, or have seen it as a pathway, as a bridge towards the eventual assimilation of Taiwan into China. Where that might change is if Taiwan were to announce outright independence from China. In other words, formal secession from China. If it stopped calling itself the Republic of China and declared itself the Republic of Taiwan, for example. At that moment, I think the Chinese would find themselves obliged to take much more radical and drastic steps, and that could include an economic blockade, and it could involve the overflight of Chinese fighter jets over the Taiwan itself, over the island of Taiwan. And the Chinese have spoken about it. They've said they will do it. And we have to take these threats seriously. So they've not done the kind of things that the United States has done to Cuba, but that doesn't mean that they won't do similar things in future, depending on what Taiwan does.
Yeah. All right. Dorothy Tyus, $50 super chat. Thank you very much,
Wow.
Dorothy. Super sticker.
Wow.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that. Berisha says, it's time that the East rises. China, Russia, and Turkey are all focal points of the new Silk Road. They are beyond the consumer culture. The West needs to stop spreading its decadence around the world.
Well, it is the big story. It's the thing that's changing. The political weather is the rise of China, the recovery of Russia, the way those two great powers have basically discovered each other and have formed their strategic partnership, and the way they're methodically pulling Eurasia, or Eastern Eurasia at least, China, Russia, the Central Asian states, Iran, conceivably Turkey, though I have to say I'm much more skeptical about Turkey, that they're sort of pulling them all together into something that's starting to look like, a political, military and economic bloc. And that's changing the geopolitical landscape, because we see that the United States and its allies, faced by this enormous growth of this new power bloc, are responding to it. And they're responding to it by trying to do various things. And this announcement with, this treaty with Australia, this arrangement with Australia and Britain, AUKUS, that's one example of that response. Now, we've been in a world before of two great power blocs, the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. And eventually, in the 1960s, all kinds of channels of communication and treaties and arms control agreements were established. And those two great power blocs found a way to coexist relatively peacefully with each other, despite the very adversarial relations. At the moment, we are nowhere close to being in that situation between the United States and China. The situation remains incredibly fluid. Nobody has yet accepted either side's red lines. There's great arguments and quarrels about this. And frankly, if I have to say it, the situation looks more tense today than it has ever done in my lifetime. And that's the reality of it.
Yeah. Valley S, thank you very much for that super chat. The great Valley S. Flying Boar says, super chat says, Australia is made up of old British convicts.
Well, it's a lot more than just that. Yeah. Can I just say, I mean, I've never been there, but people who've been there tell me that it's a great country. And by the way, a lot of those people who were sent to Australia as convicts are people who shouldn't have been, I mean, a lot of hardship. I mean, British criminal law in the 19th century, when they used to ship people off to Australia, was absolutely brutal. I mean, transportation to Australia, could happen, for theft of very minor items. So, let's not look at it in that way. One thing I would say, by the way, is that Peter Ustinov, the former actor, once annoyed the British intensely by saying, well, your country had its own Siberia where you used to transport people off to, and that was Australia. And I remember the British audience were furious with him when he said that. But in a way, it was true. But Australia is a lot more than just convicts. And many of those convicts were people who were just, basically in great distress and who weren't punished in anything that we would remotely call today a proportionate way. It's a fine country and it's achieved great things, and by all accounts, it's a great place to live.
Siberia. Some great authors were sent to Siberia, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely, of course. Dostoevsky, my absolute favorite author of all. He was there.
Yeah. As was Solzhenitsyn, wasn't he?
As was Solzhenitsyn and all sorts of other people. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. From Edward Turner, in May, China threatened Australia with missile attacks. Australia is doing what any other nation would do, and that is to be prepared.
Well, this is exactly the point I made at the start of the program. I mean, the Chinese, by taking this incredibly hard line against Australia, have pushed Australia into a closer relationship with the United States. I mean, I have to say, I think the Chinese have had an own goal there. Maybe Australia would have taken that step anyway, given the close relationships it had with the United States. But I think if the Chinese handled Australia in a more understanding way and had not been so, frankly, belligerent in their language, and not just their language. I mean, imposing all kinds of restrictions on Australian goods and all that kind of thing. Well, maybe the Australians would have said, well, we've got a relationship with China we don't want to sacrifice. We will support our friends and allies of the United States, but there's a limit to how far we will go. So I think the Chinese have scored an own goal there, and I think that needs to be said. I didn't touch on it on the video I've just done, which Alex spoke about at the beginning of this program, but I'm glad I'm able to make that point now.
And that video will be up in a couple of hours, guys. It'll be up on Alexander's channel, and it will be up on Locals, the Duran.locals.com. So look out for that video where Alexander gets into some more detail of this story, this huge story. Let's get to some more questions. Alexander from Hunger. There's been a rise in anti-democratic comments on this channel, and it's very simple to see why. Democrats have to ask themselves, how does democracy win in a world where elections don't matter?
So true. That's absolutely correct. I mean, I am not an anti-democrat. I'm a Democrat to my fingertips. I mean, I absolutely believe in democracy. But if you want to actually take away people's faith in democracy, you do all the things that we've been seeing happening across the West, and you then go on and call it democracy. Because at that point, the whole concept becomes discredited because people are not stupid or blind. They can see what's really going on, and they can really see how the system is being rigged and is being manipulated, and that which is called democracy is a system that has become incredibly unattractive. I can argue, and people like me will argue, well, that isn't what democracy is really about. But then, of course, people will say, well, that's what you say, but that's what we're told our system is. And given how bad and tawdry it's become, we are not going to go along with you. So I think you made an entirely valid and correct point.
Thank you very much for that super chat. And Youngblood wants to know, given New Zealand's response, haven't they exposed their true alliances, or is it just juvenile politics?
No, I don't think it's juvenile politics. I think, I presume when you say New Zealand, you mean Australia here, but perhaps Australia. I mean,
no. I think New Zealand. I think Youngblood means that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Youngblood, in the live chat. I think the fact that New Zealand weighed in on this, or they've been silent so far.
As far as I know, they've been silent. Maybe they've been more.
So does that expose their alliances, or the fact that they're not weighing in?
Well, maybe, but I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think if they are being silent, if they're trying to maintain a distance, sooner or later, the reality is they will be brought back into this system, because I can't imagine New Zealand holding out against Australia, Britain, and the United States. I think that sooner or later, whether people in New Zealand want it or not, they will become part of this system of alliances too.
Alexandre says they weighed in. Just let us know in the live chat what they've said, if they've weighed in.
I mean, there is so much going on that it wouldn't surprise me.
New Zealand banned the ships.
Oh, they banned.
That's what I'm. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Well, I mean, I know there's very strong anti-nuclear sentiment, by the way, in New Zealand.
They won't let the subs in the ports. Is that correct, guys?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, they will not let the Australian subs into the waters. That's what Youngblood says. Okay, so what does that tell you?
Well, that does. I mean, that's a bigger move than I'd expected, to be quite honest. And that is definitely New Zealand distancing itself now from these alliances. And of course, as I said, there's very strong anti-nuclear sentiment in New Zealand. So that might explain that. But, it'd be interesting to see to what extent New Zealand is able to hold out, but against all of this. But certainly this is going to create frictions between Australia and New Zealand, and it's going to create frictions between New Zealand and the other Five Eyes states. And I wonder whether there'll be all kinds of warnings now going off to New Zealand, people telling them, well, look, if you are going to continue in this, you're not going to remain in the Five Eyes for much longer.
Yeah, they're going to get brought into the fold. I can't imagine them not getting brought into this.
I have to say, I agree.
And that takes us to Brando Commando's question, which has got here late. Any quick words on why Canada and New Zealand are not part of AUKUS? Have Trudeau Castro and Supreme Chancellor Jacinda Ardern soiled their relationship with the Five Eyes that much?
Well, very good question, actually. Why indeed? I think that's I think New Zealand, I'm not going to comment too much about, because to be straightforward about it, I don't know the situation there. I know that there is a lot, as I said, of anti-nuclear sentiment in New Zealand. I mean, people may remember going all the way back to the 1980s, there was that business with the Rainbow Warrior, the boat that was going to go from New Zealand to interfere with the French nuclear test, and the French sabotaged it, and somebody was killed, and New Zealand got very angry about that, and France was hideously humiliated over it. So I mean, there is a strong anti-nuclear sentiment in New Zealand, which I suspect hasn't gone away, and it may be that the New Zealand, which is managed to keep a balance and is a smaller country, obviously, than Australia, doesn't want to get drawn into this great epic conflict, and they don't want nuclear warships in their waters and in their ports, and that's what they're saying. But I think eventually they will be drawn in. Now, Canada is a much more interesting story. It may very well be that Trudeau, I'm going to call him Trudeau, is still wants to maintain some kind of balance with the Chinese. I mean, he's obviously annoyed them hugely over the Huawei business, but I mean, he's trying, as I understand it, to try and find a way to keep, on good terms with them. And of course, as people always remind us, there's been military exercises with Chinese troops, and apparently, I think in Canada itself at one point. So I mean, he might be trying to keep some kind of a balance. But ultimately, again, I can't imagine Canada standing outside this alliance system. I mean, that's inconceivable. Again, Canada is very closely connected with the United States, probably less so with Britain nowadays, but ultimately it will be part of the same system of alliances that we're going to see.
Yeah. Leafy Bug says nothing has changed regarding New Zealand's stance. Let's see. Heyman says, in regards to Russia, Trump couldn't fold the bad hand his predecessors left him with. In regards to China, Biden cannot fold the bad hand Trump left him with. The empire will bleed the republic dry.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with the last point. I completely agree with the last point. I don't think that they're able to. I don't think that they're able to retreat anywhere for the reasons we said in the introductory comments on this program. Now, I think that it's absolutely true about Obama wrecking relations with Russia and Trump finding it impossible to end that. And that's a major problem, and that's not been resolved. And Trump's attempts to do it only landed him in massive political trouble in the United States with Russiagate and all that. I think with Biden and Trump, first thing to say is I don't get the impression that Biden rather, let's not talk about Biden. I think that the administration does really wants to change direction with China. I don't know what Biden himself wants, because I think he's an inconsequential
ice cream.
Well, quite exactly. And of course there are some people, and we must never forget this, in the United States, in the Democratic Party, who on the contrary probably would be quite happy to see good relations with China. So it's a different thing with China and the legacy. And remember, as Alex said at the beginning of the program, Obama also was starting to shift towards a more adversarial relationship with China too. As for Trump, my very strong impression was that at the beginning of his presidency, what he wanted to do was to rebalance the economic relationship with China. He wanted to stop Chinese goods flooding into the United States. He wanted to get American industry brought back from China into the United States. He wanted what I was talking about at that time. If you remember those long programs we were doing 1, 2, 3 years ago, he wanted a civilized divorce. But of course, it hasn't worked out like that, because in the event, what happened was that even during his own administration, that divorce escalated into a geopolitical conflict. And perhaps that was inevitable, given that China is now the big challenger to American power. So I don't think that the United States really has any ability to fold its hand with China. And of course, I don't think the United States is going to fold its hand with Russia either. And I think your last point, that this is going to exhaust American resources, is spot on true.
Yeah, no turning back now. No. Let's see here from Ian. Will North Korea be pivotal? Will North Korea be pivotal for China in any conflict?
I think we're now going to find a situation where, a couple of years ago, when China and the United States, were in a sort of edgy relationship, They were sort of getting on with each other. The Chinese were utterly exasperated with the North Koreans. You went to the Chinese media, you read all kinds of incredibly critical things being written about Kim Jong-un. They made it very clear that they disapproved of the North Korean nuclear programs. They supported sanctions against North Korea in the UN Security Council. They were doing all those things. Now, of course, the calculus has completely changed because they're in a confrontation with the United States. So North Korea is now useful to them. And it's useful to them because it complicates US strategic planning. Because the US, if it wants to focus on China, it's got to worry about North Korea at the same time. And North Korea is unpredictable. And to be straightforward about it, very difficult to understand. I mean, what is Kim Jong-un up to at any one particular time? And he's now acquiring a kind of strategic arsenal. It may not be up to the level of sophistication of that of the big nuclear powers, but he's got intercontinental ballistic missiles. He's soon going to have cruise missiles, long-range cruise missiles. He's going to have nuclear submarines, or so he says, and he's before very long going to have apparently a fairly extensively re-equipped and reorganized ground military with more sophisticated tanks and armored vehicles and things of that kind. So he's becoming the leader of a country with a surprisingly strong military, all considered. And, the United States has to worry about that too. It has to worry about what's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula. And that, of course, is distracting. And I think that suits the Chinese. And if you follow the Chinese media, where a few years ago, North Korea was a problem, suddenly it's become a friend. And we see how Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un have these very friendly meetings and how they exchange friendly messages and how, from their point of view, all is well. North Korea is another country that is going to be very pleased with the fact that China and the United States are in conflict. Much like Russia, much like Iran, it's now got strategic space.
How about Germany, real quick? What's Germany saying about all of this?
No, they're not going to be happy. From their point of view, this is a bad thing. I mean, Germany, first of all, German foreign policy is basically an extension of German commercial policy. They have, invested massively in trade with China. I mean, the Germans export lots of things to China. They're major players in China. When I was in China in 2017, I was surprised at how many Germans I saw there. And they won't want at all to be put in a position of having to choose between the United States and China. I mean, what they want is to be able to be on good terms with both so that they can make more money from both. And they won't want to be pushed into a position of having to take sides. And I think they're going to resist taking sides. And because of Germany being so pivotally important to the United States in Europe, they're going to leverage that for all it's worth. And just as they've been able to get Nord Stream 2, with the United States grudgingly agreeing to that, I think you're going to see the Germans clinging on to their trade arrangements with China and benefiting themselves, and the United States going along with it because it doesn't really have much leverage over Berlin.
All right, Gary Fraser, thank you for that super chat. Alexander, let's wrap it up. Thank you, Alan Watson. Thank you, Valley S. Thank you, GEC, to our moderators. Thank you for helping us out in this live stream. Thank you to all the people that sent us questions. Thank you to everybody that watched on from Locals. Alexander, I'm going to get your video edited and up so that people can take a look at it and view it. It will be on Alexander's channel, guys. It will be on the Locals as well. The Duran.locals.com. Alexander, I think your video was it about an hour long, or
it was a bit long, shorter than that. It was about 45 minutes.
Okay,
so it's not quite the epic some of my videos.
It's good.
It's a detailed discussion of the topic.
Good, good. So you're breaking it down in more detail. So if you've watched this stream, definitely look out for Alexander's video in the next couple of hours, depending on my internet speeds. Alexander, any final words before we sign off?
No, I mean, this is a big event. I mean, this is a huge event. It's incredible, by the way, how in Britain, and we're part of this deal, it's been barely commented upon in the British media. I mean, we're talking about some, government reshuffle, which is a big topic and we'll come to. Rishi Sunak is still there, by the way. But anyway, I mean,
so he didn't shuffle the right people around.
He didn't shuffle the right people
for his own self-preservation.
For himself. Anyway, but I don't think he's strong enough to do that, actually, politically. I think he wasn't in a position to face, Johnson wasn't in a position to face the kind of political crisis that would have happened had he sacked Sunak. But that's another story for another day. The fact is, this is a huge event. This deal with Australia is a huge event, not because it's going to change the military balance. It's not going to change the military balance, but because it does show the change in the political geometry. And that's something, we've discussed in detail in this program. In my video, I go into some of the more, shall we say, granular discussions of this. But it's the geopolitical balance that has changed. And we see that the United States is now committed to challenging China. And it's exactly the point Alex was making. We're at risk in seeing the international system break down with a free-for-all, with more countries aware of the fact that this great conflict is happening, trying to position themselves around it, each of them going ahead, acquiring possibly nuclear submarines, as the Chinese say, possibly other types of weapons, who knows what. And the big one to watch is what Japan does, because Japan is the one country in the Pacific that really worries the Chinese. None of the others do to anything like the same extent. And we'll see what happens with Japan over the next few weeks and months, and perhaps year.
Yeah. Thank you, HG, for that super sticker, 78 Hong Kong dollar super sticker. Thank you very much, HG, for that. We've been here before, Alexander. It just feels like we've been in this position before. The world has been in this position before. Let's wait and see what Japan does.
Let's wait and see what Japan does. I mean,
and God help us.
And God help us, indeed.
You were going to say something a lot?
No, no, absolutely. I mean, it is. We have absolutely been here before. But can I just add one other point, which is, of course, the worst time to have a power vacuum and division in Washington. And that's what we have also. I mean, we have the United States making all kinds of moves, but not perhaps always thinking through their implications.
Who's making
those moves? And that's the other big drop. A big strategic pivot from Europe, Middle East to China, clearly explained, clearly articulated, something that a JFK might have done, or a Nixon conceivably. That's not what we are seeing. We're seeing a kind of confused pivot, leaving all sorts of unsolved problems in the Middle East and Europe, and no real clear idea of where this is going in the Pacific either. And, that's the worst possible formula, and one which could very easily lead to disaster. And, I'm not even going to start the General Milley picking up the telephone, talking to the Chinese and telling them all kinds of things, which must be making them think that Washington is a place run by people who've taken leave of their senses.
Yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll do another live tomorrow where we'll take more questions and we'll interact more from the live stream. Sparky says in a super chat, people transported to America and Australia didn't fit with authoritarian rules, so their culture evolved accordingly. Now their population is diluted over time to the world average. 80% of the people went to NE told what to do by overlords.
Well, I mean, that is a fundamental point, because, I mean, people went to Australia and to the United States because they wanted to live freely. I mean, convicts were sent there, but, I mean, a lot of people went there because they wanted the freedom that comes from that. And that explains the very strong democratic traditions in these countries. And it's horrifying to me, shocking, to see the extent to which that has eroded in both places.
Yeah. All right. We'll end it there. Take care, everybody, and we'll catch you guys tomorrow. Take care, Alexander. Bye-bye.